So is all of this resonating with Canadians? I'd like to bring in Daryl Bricker now, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, with a closer look at that public sentiment. Daryl, how are Canadians feeling about this?
Well, it's safe to say that a lot of people that were tuning in today on Global expecting to see their favorite daytime drama are being treated to another daytime drama today. I think a lot of people would really be surprised that another election was being seriously contemplated by our parliamentarians only a year after the last election, particularly in the midst of a pandemic.
And you did mention that it is the one-year anniversary of the Liberal minority government. So Canadians heading to the polls, this is something that's kind of been tested in the next bit. We've seen a couple of provincial elections, or one in New Brunswick just about a month ago, last month. And it appears there that the leader, the premier, was not punished for calling that election. Do you believe that that would happen if Canadians were to head to the polls this fall? Would the Liberals be punished for doing so?
Well, it really does depend. I mean, the assumption is that one election applies to another election. But the truth is, going into this election, the Prime Minister is in a much weaker position than either the Premier of New Brunswick was or the Premier of British Columbia was going into the election, their elections, given public opinion. The government, this federal government, remains fairly controversial with Canadians. And when you take a look at how people say they would vote if an election was held tomorrow, it's no certain thing that the Liberal Party would win a majority. So even though the Liberals are pushing this and the Conservatives are pushing this, the actual outcome of an election is far less known today at the federal level than it was at in either of those provincial situations.
Okay, and before we head on to our next question, I'd just like to mention that the voting for the first motion is now underway. Of course, we are about to see how this vote will turn out, whether this government will fall, and we would head to a fall election. Daryl, just to break this down a little more, the sentiment of going to the polls during a pandemic, are Canadians generally in support or not? And that has been something that has been brought up a lot by the opposition, saying that the Liberals would be forcing Canadians to do something that they just don't want to do.
Well, the irony in these data, when you do take a look at who wants to have an election, who doesn't want to have an election, something we've had in the polling for Global News, is that the people who want an election are basically opposition voters. The people who don't want an election are Liberal Party voters. It would seem like the absolute opposite based on what we're seeing in the House of Commons today, but that's the real situation. But the overall point here is that people would be very surprised that we would find themselves into an election in this particular time period, in this particular context, with this pandemic going on, and all of the parties would have a lot of explaining to do as to why they were being forced to contemplate having to vote again in such a short period of time.
And the realities, too, of carrying that out in all of the different jurisdictions across the country. So Elections Canada had said they would need months to figure out how this could all work across the country. Talk about the complications there that could happen.
Well, I mean, we'll hear that at the start of this, and there may be some bumps along the road, but there have been elections held all over the world. I know I've been working on them at Ipsos, and everywhere from South Korea through to the municipal elections in France. We just did an election in Bolivia. There's one, obviously a big one, coming up on November the 3rd. All of them, all of the electoral authorities are finding a way to deal with this. So yes, I'm sure that the officials at Elections Canada would rather not be dealing with this, but there are ways to hold a perfectly competent and safe election in Canada over the space of the next couple of months, even in the midst of a pandemic. So that's not going to be the issue. The bigger issue is going to be why we're doing this at all. And right now, that's very unclear, I would say, to Canadians.